So today we're going to talk about why economists cry themselves to sleep. And it's not just because they're economists. If I had to name the biggest threats to my children's future prosperity and well-being, I'd have to list two things: climate change and the growing federal debt. Now those two things are not why I cry myself to sleep. Let's talk about climate change first. Carbon dioxide acts like a big blanket. It traps heat in the Earth's atmosphere. And that carbon dioxide is produced when humans burn fossil fuels like coal and oil. So that means that every time you turn on a light, take a hot shower, go for a drive in your car, turn up the heat, turn on the air conditioning, you're dumping more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now some people don't buy that global temperatures are rising or that human beings are contributing to it. Here's a graph of global temperatures for the past couple hundred years. As you can see, the temperature bounces around in a pretty narrow range until the last 100 years where it starts shooting up. The increase in temperatures in the last several decades is much, much larger than any of the other fluctuations we've seen in previous centuries. But are humans contributing to this? Well, here's a graph of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It shows exactly the same pattern. It tracks in a very narrow range for century after century, and then suddenly starts shooting up right at the same point that humans start burning fossil fuels. Is that bad? Why should we be worried about this? Well, first of all, it's going to be harder to grow food on a warming planet. A hotter atmosphere means that rains don't come as regularly, and they're not distributed as equally across the Earth's surface. So what that means is that you're going to get catastrophic droughts in some places and catastrophic flooding in other places. We're already seeing this. 10 years ago, climate scientists thought that maybe 50 or 60 years down the road, we might start to see catastrophic droughts that wipe out the crops of an entire continent. And that actually happened last year in Russia. A hotter climate also means more energy in the atmosphere, which leads to stronger hurricanes. Hotter climate also means rising sea levels, which can flood coastal cities. Many climate scientists think it's only a matter of time before we see a new Dust Bowl in the American Midwest. But my favorite reason to be concerned about climate change is these little guys. These are called phytoplankton. They live in the ocean, and they turn carbon dioxide into oxygen. In fact, they produce half of the oxygen that we need to breathe. They need a relatively narrow range of sea temperatures in order to survive. And because of climate change, the oceans are warming, and these guys are dying off. So is climate change the reason why economists cry themselves to sleep? No. Let's talk about the second problem, the national debt. Every year, the U.S. federal government spends much more than it brings in tax revenue. Last year, it spent about $1.3 trillion more than it brought in. That's about 8% of GDP. So when the government spends more than it brings in taxes, it has to borrow the difference. And that yearly borrowing is called the annual deficit. It's those accumulated deficits over many years that adds up to the U.S. national debt. So why is the government running such high deficits? Well, two reasons. Revenues are really low, and expenditures are really high. Revenues are low because of the lingering effects of the 2008 financial crisis and the recession. Since 9/11, defense spending has been relatively high. The Bush tax cuts are also keeping revenues lower than they would be otherwise. But the primary drivers of government spending are Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And while today's deficits are large, they're nothing compared to the deficits we're going to see over the next several decades. So why is this bad? How does that affect us? Well, have you been watching what's been going on with Greece? When a country's government debt grows past a certain point, lenders are going to stop lending it money, thinking that they're never going to get paid back. When that happens, the country's financial system implodes and brings down the rest of the economy with it. And that's what we're seeing in Greece and might see in Spain and Italy. The United States has a long way to go before it gets into Greece's situation, but it's on the same trajectory. Here's why economists cry themselves to sleep. There's actually a policy that would significantly address both of these problems of climate change and federal debt. It's called a carbon tax. A carbon tax would make everything that uses a lot of fossil fuels more expensive. Now, I know a lot of you are saying, wait, why would an economist be in favor of a tax? Aren't taxes harmful to the economy? Well, yes, taxes can be harmful to the economy. But if we get a new Dust Bowl in the American Midwest because of climate change, that's also going to hurt the economy. More expensive electricity would make people turn off the lights, turn down their thermostats. Take mass transit, people would carpool or ride their bike to work. And people would make all of these changes not out of altruism, but out of sheer budgetary necessity. Now, some people doubt that these changes would ever happen. But the thing is, it's already happened. In 1950, it took twice as much fossil fuel energy to produce $1 of GDP as it does today. And yes, that's adjusting for inflation. Why? Well, fossil fuel prices are much higher than they were back in the 50s, and as a result, people have changed their behavior and they've gotten more efficient over the past couple of decades. So a carbon tax would just take that ongoing process and put it into fast forward. With a carbon tax making fossil fuels more expensive, all of a sudden alternatives like solar, wind, wave, geothermal are going to be cost competitive. So a carbon tax is a strong way to address the climate change problem. But would it also address the federal debt? Well, it's a tax. It would bring in more revenue. The United States currently emits about 7 billion tons of carbon every year. Even if a carbon tax cut those emissions in half, if the tax was $50 per ton, that would still raise about $200 billion in revenue. That's not enough to entirely close our federal deficit, but it'll help. So here we have a policy that will simultaneously address the two biggest threats that future generations will face: climate change and the growing federal debt. So why do economists cry themselves to sleep at night? So here we have this one policy that would go a long way to solving both of these problems, and politicians are never going to vote for it. They're afraid of how voters will react when they hear about a new tax. And that is why economists cry themselves to sleep.